She said it to my face. Not in anger, not in a moment of heat where things slip out and get regretted. She said it the way someone says the weather is changing. Calm, certain, like she'd been rehearsing it. "You're not welcome in this house anymore, Evelyn." My son was standing 3 feet behind her. He didn't say a word. I'm 71 years old. I'm standing on the porch of the house I helped them buy. The house where I painted the nursery with my own hands when they told me they were expecting. The house where I spent 4 Christmases and 3 Easters and more Sunday dinners than I can count. And my son, my Daniel, just stood there. I want to tell you what happened next. I want to tell you what Cassandra didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, because they thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was the beginning of mine. Before I get into all of this, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or your state in the comments. I always read them. Every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not that afternoon on the porch. Long before that. Back to when Daniel was 11 years old, and we were living in a small house in Columbus with mismatched furniture and a backyard that needed more work than I ever had time for. His name is Daniel, my son, my only child, though you'd never know it by the way things ended up. I had him at 30. Frank, my husband, and I had been trying for 4 years by then. We'd lost 2 pregnancies before Daniel. We never talked about those losses much, not the way people do now, not with the language that exists for it. You just kept going. You buried it somewhere and kept going. So when Daniel arrived, healthy, furious, 9 pounds 3 ounces, I held him in that hospital and thought something had finally gone right. Frank worked in commercial insurance. 30 years with the same company in Columbus. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing people asked about at parties. But he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who paid bills the day they arrived, who kept receipts, who wrote things down. I was a middle school art teacher for 27 years. We weren't rich, but we built something careful and real. Daniel grew up watching us work for everything we had. He knew what things cost. He knew what effort looked like. At least I thought he did. He met Cassandra at 31. She was pretty in a deliberate way, the kind of woman who is always aware of how she looks in a room. That's not a criticism, just an observation. She worked in marketing, which, looking back, explains some things. The first time Daniel brought her home for dinner, I made pot roast, Frank's favorite. I'd made the rolls from scratch. I set the table properly. Cassandra sat down, looked at the bread basket and said, "Oh, I don't really do carbs." Frank said, "More for me then." And that was that. I told myself it was nothing. People are different. She's nervous. She's new. They were engaged 14 months later. I smiled at the announcement. I helped plan the shower. I contributed $8,000 to the wedding without being asked, because Frank and I wanted to, because we loved Daniel, because you do those things. The wedding was beautiful. Cassandra wore a dress that cost more than our first car. I danced with my son and thought about the boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, watching old westerns. And I cried the way mothers cry at weddings, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming strangeness of time passing. That was 7 years ago. The changes didn't arrive all at once. That's what I want you to understand. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of small adjustments, each one reasonable on its own, each one something you could explain away if you tried hard enough. And I tried. God help me, I tried. First came the holidays. For the first 2 years, we rotated. Thanksgiving at their place 1 year, Christmas at ours the next. It worked. It wasn't perfect. Cassandra had a mother in Pittsburgh who had her own preferences, but we made it work. Frank and I would drive over to Columbus, or they'd drive to us, and we'd have our table and our food and our family. Year 3, Cassandra decided she wanted to start her own traditions. Daniel called me to explain it. "Mom, we're doing something smaller this year. Just the two of us. We need to establish our own holiday routines." He'd clearly rehearsed that. Establish our own holiday routines. That's not how Daniel talked. I said, of course. I understood. Newlyweds need space. I spent Thanksgiving that year with Frank at a restaurant downtown. The food was fine. The tables were close together. The couple beside us had a baby who kept grabbing the centerpiece. Frank held my hand across the table and said, "Next year we'll go somewhere warm." He was always doing that, looking ahead, planning the next good thing. Frank died 14 months later, heart attack. Same as the doctors had been warning about for 3 years. His cholesterol, his blood pressure, the family history he always dismissed with a wave of his hand. He was in the garage when it happened. I found him on the floor beside the riding mower, one hand reaching toward the workbench. I don't know if he was trying to get up or just reaching for something to hold. I called 911, then I sat down on the cement floor next to him and held his hand until they came. The paramedics were gentle, young. One of them couldn't have been more than 25, and she spoke to me so carefully. The way you speak to someone you're afraid is going to shatter. Frank was 67 years old. Daniel came as fast as he could. He drove 90 minutes from Columbus and arrived an hour after they'd taken Frank. He walked in the door, and his face just collapsed. He was 42 years old, and he looked 11 in that moment. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and I thought, at least we have each other. Cassandra arrived 2 hours after Daniel. She kissed my cheek at the door and asked if there was anything she could do. I said, no, I was managing. Thank you for coming. She nodded and took out her phone. She was on it most of the night. I told myself she didn't know how to grieve. Some people don't. Some people disappear into their screens because they don't know where else to go. I made every excuse I could find, and I used them all. Here's something my children, my son and his wife, did not know. Frank had been careful with money his entire life. 30 years of steady work, modest living, no unnecessary debt. We never told Daniel the specifics because Frank believed a parent's finances were their own business until the time came to pass them on. He'd say, "We're not going to raise a boy who sits around waiting for something to fall into his lap." So Daniel didn't know about the rental properties. 2 of them, a duplex on the east side of Columbus that Frank had bought in 1989, and a small commercial space in Westerville he'd picked up in 2004. Fully paid off, both of them, generating income for 20 years without Daniel ever knowing they existed. He didn't know about the investment accounts Frank had quietly been building since we were in our 30s. He didn't know about the life insurance policy, the real one, not the smaller one through Frank's employer that we'd mentioned once in passing. He thought his father was a careful middle-class man who'd saved reasonably and lived reasonably. He didn't know his father was worth $2.1 million. Neither did Cassandra. The day after Frank's funeral, a Tuesday, February, cold the way Ohio cold is, specific and relentless, I met with our attorney, Thomas Garvey. Thomas had been Frank's lawyer for 22 years, a quiet man from Granville, who wore the same style of corduroy jacket in every season and made very good coffee in his office. The will was simple and complete. Everything to me. No division, no conditions. Frank had written it clearly. Evelyn is the surviving spouse and the sole beneficiary of everything. Thomas explained that the properties, the accounts, the insurance, all of it came to me. I was to manage it as I saw fit. And when the time came, whatever I chose to pass on would be my decision alone. Frank had thought it through. He always thought things through. I thanked Thomas and drove home through snow that hadn't been there that morning. The first year after Frank died, Daniel called twice a week. I know. I should say that clearly. He was good at first. He drove out to see me twice a month. He helped me sort through Frank's office, all those files and folders, and 30 years of organized paperwork. He fixed things around the house. He called on Saturday mornings to check in. Cassandra came less often. When she did, she was polite but distant in the way a hotel receptionist is polite but distant, doing the job without being in the room. I noticed, but I said nothing. Grieving people are allowed to be uncomfortable around other grieving people. I gave her room. By year 2, Daniel's visits had stretched to once a month. The calls moved to Sunday evenings, brief, checking in. I filled the time with what you fill time with. My garden, my art, a friend named Lorraine from the school where I'd taught, who brought me casseroles on Tuesdays more often than I needed, but never as often as I secretly appreciated. Then came the grandchildren. They had 2. Cooper, who arrived when Daniel and Cassandra had been married 4 years, and then Maura, 2 years after that. I love those children more than I know how to say. Cooper has Frank's eyes, that specific gray-green, the color of Lake Erie in November. Maura has a way of tilting her head when she's listening that is so exactly Daniel at 4 years old that the first time I noticed it, I had to go into the bathroom and breathe for a moment. I babysat in the early years. Not as often as I would have liked, but enough. Cassandra had a list of how things should be done. Nap times, snack times, which shows they were allowed to watch, which were not. I followed the list. I didn't argue with it. I wasn't there to parent. I was there to love. Those visits meant everything to me. Here's the thing about Cassandra. She never did anything obvious. No single terrible incident I can point to and say, that is the moment. It was different. It was the accumulation. The little revisions, one at a time, each small enough that to name it felt petty. The Christmas she told Daniel they couldn't afford a trip to see me. In the same year I'd seen their vacation photos from Cabo. The birthday I drove to Columbus with a cake and found a note on the door. Sorry, Mom, forgot you were coming. We had plans. The grandchildren's recital I wasn't told about until after. The babysitting that stopped. Suddenly, the list of requirements was too complicated, or Cassandra's mother was available, or the kids had playdates. It just stopped. And with it went my regular sight of Cooper's gray-green eyes and Maura's listening tilt. I talked to Daniel once, just once, directly, which is not easy for me. I am a woman who was raised to keep things smooth, to absorb, to manage. I said, Daniel, I feel like I'm disappearing from your lives. I don't know what I've done, but if I've done something, I need you to tell me. He looked genuinely pained. He said, Mom, it's not like that. We're just busy. Life is busy. You know how it is. I said, I know how it is, but I'm your mother, and I'm lonely. He hugged me, held on longer than usual, said he'd do better. He didn't do better. The calls stretched to every 2 weeks, then monthly, then occasions only. Cassandra had managed it so gradually that Daniel couldn't see the shape of it. When you're inside something, you can't see the edges. It was a Sunday in October when she said it. I had driven to Columbus unannounced. I know that's not advised. But I had baked a pie, apple, from the tree in my backyard that Frank planted in 1991, and it was Cooper's birthday week, and I wanted to bring it. I stood at the door, knocked. Cassandra answered. She looked at me, then at the pie, then back at me. And her face did something I'd seen before in smaller ways, but never this clearly. It settled into something that wasn't quite irritation, and wasn't quite coldness. Something deliberate. Evelyn, not Mom, never Mom. I said I had tried, which was true. The call had gone to voicemail. She opened the door wider, not to invite me in, just to fill the frame better. Look, I've been wanting to say this for a while. We need to establish some boundaries. Daniel and I have talked about this. We need our space as a family, our own family. And I need you to understand that you can't just show up here. I heard Daniel's footsteps in the hall. Heard him stop. You're not welcome in this house anymore, Evelyn. Not without a very specific invitation. I looked past her at Daniel. He was looking at the floor. I set the pie down on the porch railing. I said, "All right." And I drove home. I want to tell you what I felt on that drive. Not what I did. That comes later. But what I felt. Because I think that matters. For the first 20 minutes, nothing. A numbness that felt familiar from the days after Frank died. The road was straight and flat. Then anger. Real anger. The kind that sits behind your sternum and radiates. Not at Cassandra, though she was part of it. At Daniel. At the boy who had looked at his shoes while his wife told his mother she wasn't welcome in their home. At the 42-year-old man who had said nothing. Nothing. Then something else underneath the anger. Something quieter and older. Recognition. I had seen this coming for 4 years. I had watched it arrive the same way you watch a season change. Gradually, then completely. I went home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank and I had sat every morning for 34 years. And I looked at his chair across from mine, and I thought, what would you do, Frank? I knew exactly what he would do. He would stop waiting, and he would get organized. I called Thomas Garvey the next morning. He picked up himself, the way he always did, the way that small firm lawyers from Granville do. I said, "Thomas, I need to make some changes." He said, "Come in Thursday." I went in Thursday. I told him everything. The years of it. The October Sunday. Daniel at the door, looking at his shoes. I told him clearly and without drama, because that's how Thomas and I had always worked. He listened. He made notes in his small, precise handwriting. When I was done, he said, "Evelyn, you understand that you have complete discretion over everything. The properties, the accounts, the trust structures, all of it." I said, "Yes, I understood." He said, "And you know what you want to do?" I said, "I have some ideas." He almost smiled. Thomas Garvey almost never smiled, so that almost was significant. We met 3 more times over the following 2 months. What I had when we were finished was a restructured estate plan that Frank would have approved of completely. Clean, documented, final. Here is what Daniel and Cassandra did not know. The duplex on the east side of Columbus, the one Frank bought in 1989 for $87,000, was worth $640,000 in the current market. The commercial space in Westerville was worth $290,000. The investment accounts had grown to $880,000. The life insurance had paid out $400,000 the year Frank died. I had been living on my teacher's pension and the rental income, untouched. The rest had sat and grown. Total, just over $2.1 million. Plus the house, paid off, valued at $310,000. Cassandra had told my son I was not welcome in their home. She had done it with the confidence of a woman who assumed she understood the situation completely. She did not understand the situation at all. I did not call Daniel for 8 weeks after that Sunday. He called me once, 3 weeks in. Left a voicemail that was warm but vague. "Just checking in, Mom. Hope you're good. Call me back when you get a chance." I listened to it twice. Then I set my phone down and went to my garden. At week 8, my friend Lorraine asked me how I was handling things with Daniel. I said, "I'm handling it." She looked at me over her coffee cup. Lorraine has known me for 30 years. She said, "You've got that face." I said, "What face?" "The face you had the year Frank had his first health scare, and you just went completely quiet and organized everything." I told her I was fine. She said, "I know. That's what I mean. The duplex. I called my property manager in November and told her I wanted to sell. She said the market was strong. The unit was fully tenanted, well-maintained. She said we could list at $640,000 and likely close at or above. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. It sold in 19 days. Daniel didn't know it existed. He certainly didn't know it was gone. I also made a call in November to a woman named Patricia Webb. Patricia ran a nonprofit in Columbus that focused on arts education in public schools, the kind of work I had done for 27 years, the kind of work that never has enough funding. We had met once at a fundraising event 3 years earlier. I had liked her immediately. I told her I wanted to make a significant gift, not publicly, not with my name on anything, just funds that would allow her to expand the after-school program she'd been trying to grow for 2 years. Patricia was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure. Let's talk about what you need." December came. No invite from Daniel and Cassandra. Not a Christmas invitation. Not a mention of the grandchildren's school pageant that I saw mentioned on Facebook because Cassandra posted about it there. Just silence. The same silence as October, as November. Polished, smooth. I spent Christmas with Lorraine and her daughter's family. 3 loud grandchildren, a dog with opinions, too much food. It was chaotic and warm, and I went home with leftover pie and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Gratitude that wasn't mixed with waiting. In January, I put the Westerville commercial space on the market. In February, I met with Thomas again, and we finalized the trust documents. Here is what those documents contained, and here is what I want you to hear clearly. Cooper and Maura, my grandchildren, those 2 specific children with the gray-green eyes and the listening tilt, each had an educational trust established in their names, fully funded, enough to cover 4 years of college, graduate school if they wanted it, a reasonable start to whatever they chose to do next. The funds would be managed by Thomas's firm, not by Daniel, not by Cassandra. Accessible to Cooper and Maura directly when they reached 21. There was a letter attached to each trust, written by me, 6 pages, about Frank, about who he was, about the summer Daniel was 11, and Frank taught him to change a tire in the driveway at 6 in the morning because he said every man should know how to do that. And Daniel had been furious about being woken up, and Frank had just handed him the wrench and said, "We're doing this now." About the Tuesday mornings, Frank and I had coffee before anyone else was awake and just talked about nothing, about everything, about what it means to build something carefully over a long time and then leave it for the people who come after you. The letter ended with this: "Your grandfather and I loved you before you were born. That love has nothing to do with anything else in this document. But love and access are different things, and only one of them was taken from me." I sealed both letters and gave them to Thomas. March. The Westerville property sold. The house Frank and I had lived in for 31 years. The house with the backyard and the apple tree, and Frank's workshop off the garage, where he built Daniel a wooden train set when he was 3. I stood in that workshop one last time and put my hand on his workbench and talked to him the way I've gotten used to doing, quietly, without expecting an answer. I told him what I was doing and why. I think he would have agreed. I think he would have said, "Evelyn, do what you need to do." The house sold in 11 days, $318,000, cash offer. I packed what fit in boxes I could carry myself, the photo albums, the quilt my mother made, Frank's wedding ring on a chain I'd been wearing since the hospital, a painting I did in my first year of art school that somehow still hung in our bedroom after 40 years, my good kitchen knife, which I've had since 1987, and which is simply superior to all other knives, and I refuse to part with it. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the curtains I'd sewn by hand in 1998, I gave away or donated. I didn't need any of it where I was going. I moved to Beaufort, South Carolina. Frank and I had driven through once, 20 years ago, on a road trip we took when Daniel was in college. We'd stopped for lunch and then walked by the waterfront for an hour before we needed to get back on the road. Frank had said, we should come back here sometime. We never did. I thought, I'll do it for both of us. I found a small house 3 blocks from the water. Not large, not grand, a front porch, a proper kitchen, a garden space that would need work. The couple who sold it to me had lived there for 30 years. The wife pressed my hand at the closing and said, "We hope you'll be happy here." I moved in on a Thursday in late March. That first evening, I sat on the front porch with a glass of sweet tea I'd made too sweet on purpose, the way I like it when no one is watching, and I listened to the neighborhood settle into night. Someone's wind chime 2 houses down. A dog somewhere. The distant, particular quiet of being near water. I hadn't given Daniel the address. I hadn't called to tell him I'd left Ohio. He found out through a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lives next to the old house, is 74 years old, and does not entirely understand what she should and shouldn't say. Daniel called the house in April, got a disconnected number, called Mrs. Patterson to ask if everything was all right, and Mrs. Patterson told him the house had sold in March, and the moving truck was there and gone in a day. Daniel called Thomas. Thomas correctly and professionally told him he couldn't discuss my private affairs. Lorraine told him I was fine, and that as I wanted him to know where I was, I would tell him. I found out about all of this later, from Lorraine, who reported it with the mild satisfaction of someone who has been watching a slow injustice and is glad it's unwinding correctly. Cassandra, from what I understand, did not take the news of the house sale calmly. She began calling Thomas directly, asking questions about Frank's estate, about my assets, about what I had and where it was. Thomas told her politely and precisely that he was not her attorney and could not help her. The email came in May, not from Daniel first, from Cassandra. The subject line was, "Mom," which was the first time she had ever called me that. Mom, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I know our last conversation was difficult, and I want to address that. Daniel and I have been talking, and we both feel like things got off track somewhere, and we'd really like to reconnect. Please let us know where you are so we can come visit. The kids miss you. We all miss you. Family is so important, especially now. Please reach out. Cass, I read it 4 times. I noticed what wasn't in it. No acknowledgement of what she'd said on the porch. No reference to the years of exclusions, the uninvitations, the holidays. No sorry. No understanding of why I had left or what had led to it. Just, we want to reconnect. The kids miss you. Family is important. And that word, Mom. 3 days later, Daniel wrote separately. His email was longer, more genuine in its confusion. Mom, I don't understand what happened. I know things haven't been perfect, and I take responsibility for some of that. I do. But you sold the house and left without telling us. We can't reach you. I'm worried. Please just let me know you're okay. I wrote back to Daniel, not to Cassandra, to Daniel. I kept it short. I told him I was healthy. I told him I was living somewhere I'd always wanted to live. I told him I wanted him to know those things so he wouldn't worry about my well-being. I said, when you're ready to talk about what happened, and I mean really talk about it, not to reconnect because something changed and you're worried about what you might have lost, but because you genuinely want to understand what these past years have been like for me, then I'm here. I'll always be your mother, but I am done being available on terms that cost me everything and give me nothing. He wrote back 2 hours later, just, I understand. I'm sorry, Mom. I need some time to think. That was the first honest thing he'd said to me in 4 years. 8 months since I moved to Beaufort. I have a garden that is finally doing what I wanted it to do. The tomatoes came in late, but plentiful. I joined a watercolor class on Tuesday mornings at a community center 3 blocks away. I have 3 women there I have lunch with afterwards, every single week, without fail. We are loud in restaurants. I was not expecting to be a woman who is loud in restaurants at 71, but here we are. Lorraine visited in September. We drove to Savannah for the day and had too much wine at dinner and laughed at things that wouldn't have seemed funny sober. She said I looked like myself again. I didn't know how to answer that, except to say I thought she was right. I have not seen Cooper and Maura. This is the part of the story that does not have a clean resolution yet, and I want to be honest about that. I miss them, specifically and constantly. I think about Cooper's eyes and Maura's tilt. I think about what they must understand of all this, or not understand. They are 8 and 6. They don't have the language for what happened. But they have Thomas. Thomas has the trusts with their names on them. Thomas has the letters. Whatever happens between me and Daniel and Cassandra, whatever version of this story they're told before I get to tell them myself, the day Cooper turns 21, he'll sit down with a document that says his grandfather was worth $2.1 million, that his grandmother made choices with that money while she was alive, and that one of those choices was to make sure he had what he needed, regardless of what his parents did or didn't do. And there will be a letter that explains, in plain language, the rest. Maura will have the same. That's the thing about money managed carefully by people who understand that love and inheritance are not the same thing. It waits. It doesn't get used as leverage. It doesn't disappear into a family argument. It just waits, quietly, for the people it was always intended for. Frank understood that. He built it that way. I just finished it. Daniel called me last week. Not an email this time. He actually called. I let it ring twice, and then I answered. He didn't say much. He asked how I was. I told him. He told me what Cooper had done at school, something about a science project on weather patterns. He told me Maura had started reading chapter books. We talked for 22 minutes. He didn't bring up the estate. He didn't bring up Cassandra. He didn't ask where I was. At the end, he said, I've been thinking about what you said, about these past few years. I've been thinking about it a lot. I said, good. He said, I don't have the right words yet. I said, that's okay. Take the time. There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly. More like the silence of two people who have been speaking different languages for a long time and are just beginning to find some common ground. He said, I love you, Mom. I said, I love you too, Daniel. And then he said he had to go pick up the kids. I sat with the phone in my hand after we hung up, on my front porch in Beaufort, with the wind chime 2 houses down, and the particular light that South Carolina does in November that Ohio never quite managed. Warm, golden, the kind of light that makes the late afternoon feel like something is beginning rather than ending. I don't know what happens next. That's not me being evasive. I genuinely don't know. Maybe Daniel finds his way back to being someone I recognize. Maybe Cassandra becomes someone different than she's been. Maybe the grandchildren grow up and they find me when they're 21, and we start fresh, without the weight of the middle years. Or maybe none of that happens. Maybe this is as close as it gets. Either way, I'm in Beaufort, South Carolina. I have a garden. I have a Tuesday watercolor class, and 3 loud women I have lunch with. I have Frank's ring on a chain and an apple tree I had to leave behind, and the knowledge that what he built, I protected. Cassandra said I wasn't welcome. She was right about one thing. I didn't belong there anymore.